The phone rang at 3 a.m., and I knew something was wrong. It was Vernon, Elvis's father, and his voice was shaky, almost breaking. "Doc, you need to come to St. Louis. Elvis is in trouble." My heart raced as I grabbed my coat and rushed to the airport. By the time I arrived at the hotel, the situation was dire. Elvis was in his room, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. He was still in his pajamas, a sheet pulled halfway over him, and he had lost control of his bowels and kidneys. It was a scene of chaos and fear. Joe, Elvis's trusted friend, was frantic, pounding on the door. When he finally got in, he hollered for me. I grabbed my medical bag and dashed into the suite. Elvis's skin was cold and damp, and his body was limp. I could see he was in the midst of a severe reaction, but I had no idea what had caused it. My hands trembled as I prepared a syringe with a liquid stimulant to try to stabilize his breathing. "Elvis, can you hear me?" I whispered, trying to keep him calm. His eyes fluttered open, but he was barely responsive. Joe and I quickly undressed him and helped him into a cold bath, hoping to bring his temperature down and shock his system back to life. Slowly, he began to respond, but it was clear he was still in a fog. By the time the show was supposed to start, Elvis was still semi-conscious, but we had no choice. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, was demanding that he go on stage, no matter what. I stayed by his side, speaking softly to him, trying to keep him focused. When he finally stumbled onto the stage, the audience could see he was not himself. His performance was weak, and he seemed to be fighting to stay awake. After the show, I knew I had to get to the bottom of what had happened. Elvis's appearance had changed drastically in just a few months. He was bloated, his face and hands swollen, and his eyes and lips puffy. He was a shadow of the man I had seen in Hawaii, just a few months earlier. I asked him for time to work on his health issues, but he was agitated and preoccupied, and he had to leave for Los Angeles. 10 weeks later, Elvis's divorce from Priscilla became final. I wondered what the future held for him, but my answer came soon enough. I received an urgent call from Graceland. Elvis was back in Memphis, and he needed help. His breathing was labored, and his condition was alarming. I rushed to Graceland, and when I saw him, I barely recognized him. His face and hands were puffy, his eyes and lips swollen, and his breathing was labored. He was in a semi-comatose state, and I knew we had to act fast. I administered a shot to stabilize his breathing, and began giving him oxygen. I called in a nurse to keep an eye on him, but his condition did not improve. An ambulance arrived, and we rushed him to Baptist Memorial Hospital. The doctors and I worked to stabilize him, but we were puzzled by his condition. His body was swollen, and his stomach was distended. We suspected an allergic reaction or congestive heart failure, but we needed more tests to be sure. Elvis's history of heart disease in his family made us cautious. We called in a cardiologist, but the tests ruled out heart failure. The doctors suspected an acute drug reaction, and Elvis's symptoms pointed to Cushing's syndrome, a condition caused by an excess of corticosteroids. His body was full of fluid, and his stomach was swollen with air and feces. We discovered that Elvis had hepatitis and a fatty liver, and his eyesight was threatened by glaucoma. I called in specialists to help, including a gastroenterologist to evaluate his liver and a psychiatrist to help with his drug use. Elvis denied abusing drugs, but he eventually admitted that Dr. Leon Cole, a Beverly Hills physician, had been treating him with Demerol and cortisone shots for his back and neck pain. The injections also contained Novocaine to reduce pain at the injection sites. Elvis's body had been poisoned by the combination of drugs, and he was severely addicted to Demerol. The doctors decided to start him on methadone, a synthetic substitute narcotic used to wean him off the drugs. It would be a long and difficult process, but it was the only way to save his life. As I sat by his hospital bed, I felt a deep sense of responsibility. Elvis was a legend, but he was also a man in pain, and he needed help. I knew the road ahead would be tough, but I was determined to do everything I could to get him back on his feet. Elvis returned to Graceland on November 1st, 1973, free from the addictive medications that had caused his hospitalization. I was relieved to have him back, and I could finally focus on treating his specific health issues. First, I tackled his insomnia, which I believed was the root of many of his problems. I suggested he enter a sleep clinic, but he wasn't ready for that, so we tried an experiment. I told Elvis to stay awake as long as he could, until he fell asleep without any sleeping pills. I even had Sam Phillips, a friend who owned a recording studio, make a sleep tape for Elvis. I told Elvis, for the first time in a long time, you have no place to go and nothing to do. You can read, watch TV, and do whatever you want. Unfortunately, the experiment didn't work. Elvis stayed awake for 3 days and 3 nights. His cooks, wanting to make him feel better, served him all his favorite dishes. He ate a lot, which only added to his problems. I realized I needed a new plan, so I decided to focus on his diet. Elvis's weight fluctuations were mostly due to bloating, but I thought his diet could still be contributing to his health issues, especially his chronic intestinal problems. I suggested to his cooks that they replace sweet desserts with fruit and switch to a low-carb diet. They looked at me like I was crazy. Elvis was their boss, and they would cook whatever he wanted. I knew it would be easier to control his diet on the road than at Graceland. Elvis's insomnia was still a problem, so we had to reintroduce some sleep aids. I told him I couldn't trust him to handle his own medications anymore. I explained that sometimes he took medication when he was half asleep, which could lead to over-medicating. I offered to manage his medications, and he agreed, at least for a while. He would call me if he needed anything. After resting for 10 days, Elvis left for Palm Springs, and then headed to Los Angeles to visit Lisa Marie. When he returned, he dove into recording at Stack's studio. The sessions were stressful, and the band members he wanted weren't available. The whole experience was a disappointment, and Elvis was unusually lethargic. I was worried about his depression and suggested he see Dr. Knott or Dr. Fink for a follow-up, but he declined. I thought maybe his body just needed more time to heal. Elvis's adrenal glands had been affected by his illness. They could function normally under normal circumstances, but not during stressful times. By the end of the year, it was clear that Elvis's depression was causing physical symptoms. He wasn't asking for pain medication, so I thought the detox had worked. But I could see in his eyes the toll his illness had taken. I realized that some illnesses leave lasting scars, and Elvis was starting to understand that actions have consequences. In January 1974, we convinced Tom Parker to reduce Elvis's Las Vegas engagements from a month to 2 weeks. This was a big win. Elvis's first show back was amazing, and he received great reviews. After the Vegas engagement, my son Dean and I visited Graceland. Dean, a top racquetball player, offered to teach Elvis to play. Elvis loved the idea. He was already into karate, but it was too intense for him. Dean said he could teach Elvis's friends and their partners to play too. We thought racquetball would help Elvis stay active, avoid temptation, and lose weight. Parker, who usually treated me like a hanger-on, finally saw the value of having a doctor on tour. He even asked for my help when he hurt his hip. Parker and Elvis were having more arguments about their business, and it was affecting both of them. They started avoiding each other to keep things from getting worse. Elvis played Memphis in the spring of 1974, for the first time since 1961. The shows sold out quickly, and Parker added a 5th one. Elvis was more nervous than usual, but once he got on stage, he was the king of rock and roll. The 5th show was a hit, lasting over an hour and a half. RCA recorded it and released it as Elvis, as recorded live on stage in Memphis. When Elvis left for Tahoe a couple of months later, I felt confident enough to just travel out for the opening. My nurse, Tish Henley, stayed for the rest of the tour. I had learned that I couldn't trust Elvis with his own medications. Tish was there to make sure he got what he needed. She was strict and earned the nickname, the Sergeant. While in Tahoe, an incident with a drunk fan caused trouble for Elvis's bodyguards. The tabloids exaggerated the event, claiming Elvis had stood by and watched. Dick Grobb, the security chief, knew the story wasn't true. The incident was a turning point for Elvis, and he became more involved in security. Elvis's anxiety and weight fluctuations continued to affect his health. Despite his efforts to stay active, he was frustrated and made negative comments about his weight. Some people said his drug use increased with his weight, but I don't agree. His stress, especially from his grueling tour schedule, was the real issue. Elvis's Vegas opening in late August 1974 was a letdown. He tried new songs, but the audience didn't respond well. The next night, he went back to his regular set and added more karate moves. The fans loved it, and critics praised his performance. Elvis was like a kid when things were going well. I was relieved that the shorter 2-week schedule was working better. During this engagement, Elvis met Sheila Ryan, an actress. They stayed in Vegas after the shows, visiting other entertainers and relaxing. It was a good sign that his health was improving. Before returning to Memphis in September, Elvis bought a Stutz Blackhawk, his favorite car. He also gifted a Stutz to Dr. Elias Gainem, a friend. Back in Memphis, Elvis celebrated his success by buying gifts for his friends. He bought a double-wide trailer for his cousin Billy, a boat for Charlie Hodge, and a house for Mary Jenkins, his cook. One night he bought 11 Lincoln Mark Roman, 4 and 5 Cadillacs for his friends. Elvis couldn't stand to hurt anyone, so once he started giving, he had to keep going. On the first stop of his 4th tour of 1974, Elvis was only on stage for 30 minutes before he had to leave due to a high fever. A few days later, he was back and gave a great show at Notre Dame. But 2 nights after that, he didn't perform well. Entertainment reporters were confused about what was wrong with Elvis. His appearances and performances were inconsistent. I was in Memphis, but Vernon called, worried about Elvis's condition. He begged me to meet the tour in State Line, Nevada, where Elvis would be performing for the next 10 days. He was a mess when I arrived. One of his doctors had joined him on tour and treated him with a medication that made his blood pressure go up and down. Elvis had trouble keeping his balance and controlling his muscles. On top of that, on the first day of his show in Tahoe, he was hit with a $6,300,000 lawsuit because his bodyguards allegedly beat up a fan. He was really upset and stayed in his room with Sheila for days. After his show at the Sahara Hotel, Elvis told me he was going to Los Angeles to look at a house he wanted to sell. Later, Sheila told me they went to Las Vegas instead, because Elvis wanted to see Dr. Gainem about a new diet. Dr. Gainem had a special liquid nutrient that was supposed to help Elvis lose weight while he slept. Elvis loved the idea and decided to try it. He and Sheila stayed in a suite Dr. Gainem had built onto his house for famous clients. Elvis slept for what I heard was 3 weeks, staying knocked out on the liquid nutrient. When I heard about the sleep diet, I wasn't surprised. Elvis always looked for shortcuts. We talked many times about trying to bring some normalcy to his life instead of quick fixes. He would follow a routine for a while, but then go back to his old habits, just like most dieters do. Elvis spent Thanksgiving with Linda Thompson in Santa Monica, California. I knew about that, but I didn't know he went back to Dr. Gainem's house for another round of the sleep diet. The liquid was made from papaya juice, which was high in sugar and given to him through enrollment 4. Elvis was already borderline diabetic, and the papaya juice added more calories than a normal diet. The worst part was that the diet messed up his colon. Without physical activity, his colon couldn't function properly. By the time he finished the diet, he had gained 10 pounds. He was really mad. When he got back to Memphis, he didn't tell me about the papaya juice diet, but he looked much heavier. I tried to convince him to come to my office for tests on his liver and to check his swelling, but he just laughed it off. I learned from his aides that suspicious packages were arriving by mail, and that one of his guys was trying to get parcels from the airport. Elvis had a renewed interest in the physician's desk reference, thinking he could learn everything about drugs from a book. He would read a few books on health, and think he knew how to treat himself. Elvis didn't memorize the physician's desk reference like people say. Whenever I started him on a new medication, he wanted to know why he was taking it and what the side effects could be. He would read books on health and think he knew what was happening in his body. By the end of 1974, Elvis had all the signs of severe depression, but wouldn't agree to therapy. We talked a lot about his insomnia, which I thought was a big part of his depression. When the body can't sleep, it can't heal. Elvis could rarely sleep more than 3 to 4 hours at a time and would sleepwalk. He never wanted to go for treatment. I was getting frustrated. On January 29, 1975, I got a call from a worried Linda Thompson at Graceland. Elvis was having trouble breathing. Without going to Graceland to check on him, I called for an ambulance to take him to the hospital. This was my chance to get some answers. After Elvis was stable, we ran tests to figure out why his stomach was swollen and pushing against his lungs, making it hard for him to breathe. The tests showed high levels of barbiturates and the narcotic Demerol in his bloodstream. I was heartbroken. We worked to find the cause of his swelling and any damage to his colon and liver. I didn't know when he had started taking Demerol again or where he got it, so I ordered a detox. I thought it couldn't hurt, but the media later used it against us, saying it proved Elvis was a drug addict. During his hospital stay, Elvis's dad, Vernon, had a heart attack and was in intensive care. This made Elvis very nervous. He asked the young nurses for extra sedatives. I knew he was upset about Vernon, but I also knew he was playing a game. When Vernon got out of ICU, he had a room next to Elvis's. The hospital was starting to feel like home. After a 10-day stay, Elvis was ready to leave the hospital. He was in good health, but his opening in Vegas was a month away. We all worked to keep him active. Dean had set up racquetball lessons, and we started playing on different courts in Memphis, usually between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. Elvis loved to win, so he wanted me as his partner because I had more experience. If I couldn't play, he'd choose Dean. By picking one of us, Elvis eliminated his toughest competitors. Despite his health issues, Elvis returned to Las Vegas in March 1975 and did 29 shows. In April, he went on tour in the South and Northeast, doing almost 60 more concerts. Sometimes Linda Thompson was with him, sometimes Sheila Ryan. I never knew who would be there. He would add other models and starlets to the group. When I asked him how he kept track, he just smiled. He must have had some kind of code. Elvis loved performing, but the long tours were killing him. I tried to convince Parker to break up the tours, but he wouldn't listen. I knew how exhausting it was, and it was even worse for Elvis because of his sleep problems. In 1975, he became overwhelmed. His third tour of the year started badly. Sheila wasn't available to go with him because she was seeing James Caan and wanted to break up with Elvis. To spare his feelings, they told him she had an ear infection and couldn't fly. Elvis found a low-flying plane to let her join the tour. As Sheila tried to end things, Elvis became more determined to keep her. He cared for her deeply and had bought her a horse and invited her to move in with him. It must have been hard for both of them. Another reason Elvis wanted a woman by his side was that he couldn't sleep without one. He talked about training a girl to anticipate his needs. Elvis went into a depression when Sheila left. He was hurt by rejection. No matter what we did, we couldn't cheer him up. The trouble started during a show in Cleveland. It continued in Nassau and Norfolk. Elvis made mean comments about Kathy Westmoreland, a backup singer he dated. When she told him to stop, he did, but then he started making inappropriate remarks about the Sweet Inspirations, another backup group. Two of them walked offstage and Kathy followed. After the show, Elvis got on the plane, and we headed to Greensboro, North Carolina, where another strange incident happened. After arriving in Greensboro close to midnight, Elvis said he needed to see a dentist. We found one, and the dentist took care of whatever was wrong. Elvis then took a box of over-the-counter medications, put it in a brown paper bag, and carried it proudly. I made a big mistake by taking the bag from him in front of everyone. Elvis was really embarrassed, and I could tell he didn't like what I did. He was mad, and I felt bad about it. When we got back to the motel, Elvis was fuming. He stomped around his room, slamming doors so hard that the windows rattled. Then he went into his bedroom and disappeared. Later that night, during his concert in Greensboro, he apologized to the Sweets for his behavior in Norfolk the night before. The audience didn't know what he was talking about, but it was his way of making things right. After the concert, Elvis went back to the dentist alone for more work on his tooth. He didn't want me to interfere again. The next day, we had another confrontation. Elvis always had a bus for his team, so we could all go together from the hotel to the airport. Someone suggested we stop for food before leaving, thinking Elvis wouldn't be at the airport until late. We all agreed and stopped at a Dairy Queen. We were enjoying our meal when suddenly, a motorcycle cop and Elvis's limo zoomed past. We all panicked, ran out, and hopped on the bus heading to the airport. When we got there, Elvis was furious. Our bags weren't loaded, and since he was ready, he left without us. We were left with our luggage on the runway, and we had to wait for hours. Finally, Elvis's plane came back to pick us up. Everyone was relieved but also upset with Elvis. After the relief wore off, some of Elvis's band members started threatening to quit. By the time we landed in Asheville, no one wanted to perform that night. Elvis found out about the boycott and knew he was in trouble. He acted quickly and sent a jeweler to buy "I'm sorry" gifts for everyone he had offended. It was a huge purchase, and the jeweler even had to call his brother to bring more jewelry. Elvis bought it all. Elvis's father, Vernon, who was recovering from a heart attack, joined us at the motel in Asheville. I was talking to Vernon when Elvis came out of his room with a small pistol. As he put his arm around his father, the gun accidentally fired. The bullet grazed my chest after ricocheting off a metal chair. It was a scary moment, especially with Vernon's heart condition, but Elvis tried to make a joke out of it. We all knew he was still upset with me, but he wasn't mad enough to shoot me. Backstage in Asheville, Elvis wanted me to give him a shot to calm down. He was still agitated and wanted a narcotic, but I gave him a placebo instead. I knew he just wanted to change his mood. When Elvis was stressed, he often turned to things that made him feel good, like creating surprises or giving gifts. Some people thought his generosity was because of amphetamines, but I don't believe that. I think he just wanted to boost his spirits. After the tour, Elvis asked me to resume my nightly visits to Graceland. I would stop by after my office hours and talk with him about his plans for the evening. But staying for 3 or 4 hours was tough, and my family needed me too. I tried to build a team to help keep Elvis occupied in healthy ways, like playing racquetball. He was awkward at it, but had fun, and we all enjoyed those times. Elvis loved watching football, especially Southman games at Liberty Bowl Memorial Stadium. If people knew he was there, attendance would go up. One night, we went to a game with Linda Thompson, Barbara and George Klein, and some bodyguards. Elvis started flirting with a young hostess named Jo Kathy Brownlee. I helped him set up a date with her. They went out, and Elvis gave her a car and a diamond ring. He even invited her to Vegas, but she couldn't go because she was traveling with her mother. So Elvis asked Linda to join him in Vegas instead. A few days later, we flew to Vegas. The plane hit some turbulence, and Elvis had a panic attack. He fell to the floor and needed a shot to calm down. After we landed, he was exhausted. His colon problems were causing issues, and he had to sit down during his opening show. He wanted to impress Jo Kathy and her mother, who were sitting ringside. He improved at the midnight show, but it was clear he needed to go back to the hospital. His stomach was bloated, and he was having trouble breathing and singing. We left Vegas early and took Elvis to Baptist Hospital in Memphis. His stomach was still distended, and he was having trouble with his voice. He was also dealing with high blood pressure and high cholesterol. I worked with a team of consultants to figure out what was wrong. Elvis's health was a constant concern, and I knew he needed more help. In the mid-1970s, we doctors faced a lot of challenges because the medical equipment back then wasn't as advanced as it is today. When we examined Elvis, we found out he had an enlarged liver with fat infiltration. We were concerned about the fatty changes happening in his body. Since Elvis took a lot of Tylenol for the arthritis in his neck and spine, we wondered if the Tylenol might be causing these changes. We knew it was possible, but not very likely. We strongly recommended that he check into Johns Hopkins Hospital for a more detailed evaluation. However, Elvis refused to go. I called Father Nicholas Viron, my pastor, and asked if he could visit Elvis at the hospital. I had been a member of Annunciation, the only Greek Orthodox church in Memphis, since 1955, when I was an intern. I often asked Father Viron to visit my patients who needed spiritual comfort. Father Viron had visited Elvis before, and they had a good relationship based on their shared interest in faith and truth. Father Viron recalled, Elvis was a gracious young man, especially to his elders. He was interested in early church history and wanted to learn more. I shared books like The Incarnation by St. Athanasios, Philokalia, and sermons by St. John Chrysostom writers from the 5th and 6th centuries. Elvis was also fascinated by ancient church services like the exorcism ritual. I had a copy in Greek, so I translated it for him. He wanted a copy because he felt surrounded by evil and jealous spirits. Elvis was respectful not just to Father Viron, but also to my father, Gus, whom he called Mr. Nichopoulos. Gus was a Shriner, and Elvis knew a lot about their beliefs. He became interested in a rare and expensive book about Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian philosophy. The book was out of print, so Elvis decided to have it reprinted. He got 2 copies, one for himself and one for my dad, and had them both autographed by the author, Manly P. Hall. Elvis would read parts of the book, underline passages, and write notes to my dad about his thoughts. It was clear that Elvis was searching for a religion that aligned with his beliefs. After giving the book to my dad, Elvis would call and discuss the passages with him because he respected my dad's beliefs. When Elvis was released from Baptist Memorial Hospital, his condition was serious enough that we needed to take extreme measures. Tish, a nurse whom Elvis respected, had been managing his medications since he was released in January. Now his condition required 2 additional nurses at Graceland. They were stationed in Lisa Marie's bedroom, close to Elvis's master suite. Our goal was to create a hospital-like environment at Graceland, so Elvis would follow our instructions for his recovery more closely. Elvis enjoyed his time alone at Graceland. Sometimes he couldn't leave because of his fans, but other times he relished the quiet. He loved to read, meditate, and watch TV. Elvis was very self-educated. He always brought 2 or 3 trunks of books on tour, and had bookcases full of them in his room at Graceland. One of his favorite books was The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, a Lebanese poet and philosopher. The book inspired Elvis a lot. He would sit in bed and read aloud from it for hours, making notes and highlighting phrases that resonated with him. Reading helped me understand Elvis better and gave me insight into what he wanted from life. Elvis also enjoyed his time playing racquetball. As he grew stronger, we played more often. Finding a court became a challenge because the sport was becoming popular. Elvis decided to build his own racquetball court behind Graceland. He included a weight room and a music room, so he could relax in his backyard. Around this time, Elvis's motorcycle motorcade, which we called L's Angels, started visiting our modest home in East Memphis. His visits were unannounced and sometimes at night. The first time he came, he arrived like a helicopter landing. Edna, my wife, covered her ears and yelled at our daughter Elaine, "Get outside and see what your friends want before they make us all deaf." "I don't have any friends who ride motorcycles," Elaine replied. "Oh no, it must be Elvis." Edna was horrified. She stood there, speechless, as Elvis knocked on the back door. I opened it, welcoming him in. However, Edna had just hung our laundry to dry all over the house. The place was a mess, with underwear and towels everywhere. Elvis was a Southern gentleman and tried his best to ignore the chaos. We had a short, awkward visit. Elvis seemed shocked by the house, and later asked me to step outside. He said, "Dr. Nick, I can't have my doctor living like this." He decided to help us find a new house. We had been thinking about a larger place for a while because of our 3 teenagers. Elvis wanted to be involved in the design. He even suggested a scale model and a racquetball court in the basement. Elvis got excited about the new house, especially the idea of having his own Graceland getaway room. He loved the idea of a living room and den that opened onto a swimming pool. We eventually built the house, and Elvis was thrilled with the result. Elvis's excitement wasn't just about big things like houses and airplanes. Simple things like burgers could make him equally happy. One night after dinner, Edna had 2 leftover Greek burgers. I suggested taking them to Elvis, and she packed them up. I drove to Graceland, and the smell of the burgers was irresistible. Elvis loved them and wanted more. Soon, our Greek burgers became an obsession for Elvis. Elvis would call Edna and ask, "What's in those burgers? Why can't anyone make them taste like you do?" It became a running joke. We found ways to make the burgers for him, even cooking them at Graceland or in hotel kitchens. One night, after having burgers at Graceland, we went to see a movie. Elvis was in a great mood. While driving, he reached behind him and gave Edna a small box. She opened it in the theater's powder room and found a beautiful ring with multicolored diamonds representing the ingredients in her Greek burgers. Elvis had designed it as a special gift. Another time, Elvis was in Las Vegas with Dean and Dick. They were talking about food, and Dick mentioned a great Italian restaurant nearby. Elvis got excited and decided to go with them. He put on his sweatsuit and dark glasses, and set off to enjoy a meal at the little Italian place. Elvis was always full of surprises, and his generosity and kindness often left us speechless. He had a unique way of showing his appreciation, whether it was through a thoughtful gift or a simple act of kindness. We walked down the hall toward the elevator, and Elvis kept turning to look over his shoulder every few feet. He got in the elevator, and we rode down. Once we reached the lobby, he hung back until Dick signaled it was safe to cross. Elvis looked around nervously and whispered, "Think anybody will recognize me?" "Nah, Elvis," I said. "You got your DA jumpsuit and sunglasses on. No one would ever guess who you are." I walked ahead to arrange our getaway. "I need a Hilton car," I told the valet, thinking it would be no problem. "We don't have one," the valet said casually. I was caught off guard. "Man, I got Elvis coming out. Right now, I need a little help here." The valet got flustered. He looked around and then whispered, "See the guy over there in the cowboy hat, old Tex? When he gets his date out of the car, you grab that one." I couldn't believe it. Old Tex's car was a huge Lincoln, and the valet was telling me to take it. I just said, "Elvis," and he was giving me a Lincoln. "Look, you gotta have it back in 2 hours," the valet whispered. "He's going to the show. You gotta have the car back when he gets out." I saw Dick and Elvis walking toward me, hiding in his disguise. I motioned for Dick to get behind the wheel. Naturally, he was the one to drive the hot car with Elvis inside. Dick's a former Palm Springs police officer, you know. I slid into the back seat quickly, like I didn't know those guys up front. We got to the little restaurant, and Elvis loved it. We ordered 8, and were out of there in 90 minutes. Dick drove the Lincoln back to the Hilton, and I handed the keys to the valet. He was pretty nervous by then. "Thanks, man," I said. I felt good about getting the car back on time. Dick and I shielded Elvis as we walked back into the Hilton, making sure no one recognized him. We made a sneaky trip back up to the suite, so Elvis wouldn't be disappointed by the lack of a mob scene. We settled in, and I waited for Elvis to calm down. Then I told him about the hot car that got us to the restaurant. Elvis just stared at me, not believing it. "What, you mean that valet did that for us, gave us a car to use?" Whoa, I thought the valet had really impressed Elvis. "Yep," I said, "he sure did." I was proud. "Well, I think we need to show him we appreciate it," Elvis said and walked out of the room. Next thing I knew, I was handing over the keys to a brand new Trans Am to the valet. He looked shocked, like, "Is this a joke?" I guess he'd never gotten a tip like that. It made me feel really good. Elvis was a creature of habit. He felt comfortable doing things in a certain order. That was about the only stability he had in his life. His work schedule and medical needs were always changing, so I decided to create a plan to manage his medications. We came up with one routine for home and another for his shows. These routines would vary depending on where he was performing and what was happening with his health. On show day, someone would usually wake him up around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. He'd start with black coffee, then take an appetite suppressant, a decongestant, and his blood pressure medicine. After that, he'd eat and relax for a few hours before getting ready for the show. I thought if we could get Elvis's medications on a routine, like in the hospital, we'd have better control over any side effects. His days and nights were mixed up, but he still needed to take his meds and vitamins regularly. I prescribed the lowest doses possible, so we could adjust them easily without pushing him to toxicity. I believed using weaker drugs in combination was better than using strong ones that could make him sick. After he suited up on tour, I'd give him a vitamin B12 shot. Elvis thought B12 helped him, but it also increased his appetite, so I had to remind him. If he had congestion, I'd decide whether to give him an antihistamine or a placebo. He was afraid of clogging up, which was one of his phobias. Elvis's eyes were always a problem. The dye in his hair and eyelashes would irritate his eyes when he sweated. He wore scarves to wipe his forehead, but the ladies loved them, so he started tossing them to the fans. In the latter years, the bright lights caused photophobia, so I'd put local anesthesia in his eyes to prevent him from rubbing them during performances. In Las Vegas, Elvis developed a routine of taking a voice shot, a mixture of herbs and other stuff. Dr. Sidney Boyers, a throat specialist, made it. It had no medical justification, but Elvis swore it helped. He wanted it applied directly to his vocal cords before shows to prevent his voice from cracking. Decongestants and B12 shots were routine for him. He thought shots were more effective, so we had a hard time getting him to take meds any other way, especially on the road where they needed to work quickly. People often thought he was taking drugs, but that wasn't true. After the show, I had to assess Elvis's condition. I watched him closely during performances to see if his movements could cause injuries. There were specific songs where I could tell if he hurt himself. I didn't want him to trick me into thinking he needed pain medication when he didn't. If his pain was moderate to high, I'd give him a diluted shot of Dilaudid, which was quick-acting. I had to be careful because high pain levels could raise his blood pressure, which was dangerous given how much he exerted himself. I found out Elvis was going to other doctors for medications I wouldn't give him. If I was his primary doctor, I needed to know what other doctors were doing. I called those doctors, and they were embarrassed. Elvis could choose any doctor he wanted, but I needed to know what he was taking to avoid dangerous interactions. I tried to get the people close to Elvis to help me control his medication. I explained that if Elvis didn't work, they didn't work. Some were easier to convince than others. I also had to deal with people who abused drugs in their free time. If Elvis found out, he'd fire them. They thought they were being sneaky, but I knew. I had to handle it carefully, so they wouldn't run to Elvis and rat me out. Some people were always tattling, but it had the opposite effect. Elvis didn't like dissension, and those who caused it didn't last long. Elvis's use of recreational drugs was sporadic, a diversion during extreme stress. Some stories claim he used street drugs, but I never saw any evidence. People saw me as the doctor to go to when they got really sick. In some ways, I was like a parent, often the last to know what was really happening. On New Year's Eve, instead of his annual party, Elvis performed in Pontiac, Michigan. He set a world record with an audience of 62,500 people and made a reported record gross of $800,000. He brought along a plane full of hometown folks, including his friend T.G. Shepherd, a country music artist with 2 number-1 hits that Elvis loved. T.G. canceled a lucrative gig to support Elvis, but nothing could calm Elvis's nerves as showtime neared. He fixated on losing his voice and insisted I fly in a throat specialist. "Wait, Elvis," I said, trying to find a solution. "I know a top throat specialist here in Pontiac. I'll get on the phone and track him down. Hurry," Elvis said, pacing. I located the doctor and asked him to see the show. He agreed, and I went to meet him in the lobby. "Here's the deal," I told the doctor. "You're the only one who can ensure the show goes on tonight. You've got to be good at what you're about to do." The doctor borrowed my laryngoscope and other instruments, and we went to see Elvis. Elvis was polite and attentive, as the doctor prepared to care for his vocal cords. Elvis's vacation in Vail, Colorado, was one of his best. He rented a huge house with big fireplaces and lots of windows that showed the slopes. He wanted everyone to have a great time, so he invited Edna and her daughters, Edna's friend, and Linda Thompson, who was with him at the time. The house was filled with laughter and fun. Elvis even bought everyone snowsuits, ski boots, and gloves, and paid for skiing lessons. Elaine, who was 16, remembered how Elvis talked about turning 40. He said, "Maybe it's true life begins at 40. I feel like I'm just beginning to live, like my whole life is ahead of me." He seemed excited about a new chapter in his life, even though the media often focused on his age and weight. Elvis wasn't just about fun and games. He also gave what Kissy and Elaine called Elvis's life lectures. He would talk about staying away from drugs and how they could mess up a person's life. He was like a caring older brother, always looking out for everyone's well-being. One day, Edna got a bad migraine headache. The sun's glare on the snow was too much for her. Elvis insisted on helping. He took her to his bedroom, shut the door, and started massaging her forehead, neck, and back while reciting Bible verses. It was a bit awkward, but Edna didn't want to hurt his feelings. She told him she felt better, even though she didn't, and he pranced around proudly, thinking he had healed her. Elvis loved anything that went fast. He would ride his snowmobile up the ski slopes at 3 in the morning, much to the horror of the other parents. One night, the police caught them because they had gone beyond the red line, a caution line for skiers. Elvis flashed his own badge, and they let him off. Another time, he organized a game with saucers big discs like garbage can lids. Dean, one of the kids, hit a fence post and ended up in the hospital. Elvis, still in his ski mask, went with him and even tried to play doctor for the EMT. When they got to the hospital, Elvis offered to keep Dean's pain pills, but Dean refused. After the vacation, Elvis was excited to start his tour in March. He called and asked if Kissy and Elaine were bringing me to Graceland, so we could all ride to the airport together. When we got there, he gave each of my daughters a special necklace with a TLC Tender Loving Care logo. He told them they were now part of his group and had to wear the necklaces all the time. They were so proud and wore them everywhere, even to bed. The tours were grueling, but Elvis always gave his best. Tish Henley, who was with him, remembered how he would get nervous before each show. Joe Esposito, his bodyguard, often had to push him to get on stage. But once he was out there, he was the king of rock and roll. Things got complicated when Elvis decided to fire some of his bodyguards. He was upset about their aggressive behavior and unauthorized expenses. Vernon, Elvis's father, fired 3 of them without notice. The bodyguards were hurt and confused, especially since they were close friends. Some later said they were fired because they had confronted Elvis about his drug use, but I hadn't heard anything about that at the time. Despite the challenges, Elvis kept moving forward. He was always looking for ways to make life better for those around him, even if it meant stepping into unfamiliar territory. Elvis's world was a whirlwind of excitement and drama. After the bodyguards he had fired wrote a book exposing his personal life, Elvis felt deeply betrayed. The book, Elvis, What Happened, was meant to save him from his drug use, but it only added to his pain. He felt like it was a stab in the back from people he trusted. Around this time, Elvis was in Palm Springs, trying to avoid the fired bodyguards. One of his aides started feeding him false information about a business venture he had with Joe Esposito, Mike McMahon, and me. Joe and I had formed a company called Racquetball of Memphis, Inc., which we hoped would become a chain of racquetball clubs. We broke ground on a few buildings and talked to Elvis about joining as a partner. He didn't have to put in any money, but his name would help us attract investors and members. Elvis liked the idea and agreed to be a partner. But then one of his aides told him that we were spending his money recklessly. Elvis got angry and called McMahon, telling him he wanted out of the deal. We tried to explain that none of it was true, but Elvis was too upset. We had to change the name of our company to avoid using Elvis's name and redesign all our materials. This cost us a lot of time and money. Without Elvis's endorsement, investors lost interest, and we fell behind on our payments. We tried to get Elvis to help us with a loan, but he refused. Eventually, he paid us the $25,000 we asked for in damages and loaned us $40,000, which we paid back in 120 days. The racquetball club continued to operate for a few more years, but it was never the same without Elvis's support. Elvis was still upset with me over the racquetball mess. He asked me to come to his house one night, and I could tell he was still angry. He asked for different medications, but I didn't think they were necessary. I told him that maybe it would be better if someone else went on the tour with him. We talked about it, and he said we didn't need to do that, but I told Tish she might have to go in my place. The day before the tour, Elvis told me he had found another doctor to go with him. Tish went anyway, but she called me after the first show, worried about Elvis's treatment and how he was reacting to his medications. The show in Houston was a disaster. People got up and walked out. I was in a business meeting when I got a call from Parker. He and Vernon wanted me to come back on tour to help Elvis. I told Parker I wouldn't come back unless Elvis apologized for how he treated me over the racquetball situation. Elvis found it hard to apologize, but after a meeting with my partners, I agreed to go back. I told Parker I would have to charge them for my time on tour, because my absence from my medical practice was causing problems for my partners. I joined Elvis in Mobile, Alabama, and the next week was tough. Elvis was struggling with his medications, especially Sperrine, which affected his balance and speech. I had to be careful with his medications to make sure he could perform without embarrassing side effects. The tour was grueling, and Elvis was pushing himself to the limit. After a brutal schedule in Lakeland and Huntsville, I told Parker that I couldn't watch Elvis destroy himself. The tour in October 1976 started well in Chicago, with 2 sold-out shows. In Minneapolis, Elvis was on fire, and the crowd was wild. But when we got back to Graceland, Elvis wasn't interested in recording. He would cut a song, go upstairs for hours, and come back down to give away his clothes. The recording session was a mess, and Elvis was remorseful, giving gifts to everyone. Elvis wanted to get away from everything, so he took off to Vail with Lisa Marie and Linda. Linda was focused on her acting career, and they were spending more time apart. When she didn't return home with him, I knew their relationship was over. Elvis was at a low point, both emotionally and physically, and it was clear that he was struggling to find his way. Despite the challenges, Elvis continued to perform and touch the lives of his fans. He was a complex and talented man, but his struggles were always just beneath the surface. Even though the end was near, Elvis's presence on stage was a reminder of his enduring legacy.